time, took steps to prevent something just like this from happening, and were ready to take action in the courts and elsewhere as necessary. From a great distance, or if you weren't involved, you might think, well, look, we had an election, the election worked, everything is fine. But the truth of the matter is that people who contributed to good causes with their money or with their time made the difference in America in 2020 and 2021. We are still living in something which can be characterized as a democracy. It's very flawed, but we're still living in something that can be characterized as a democracy in large measure thanks to civil society, which is one reason why we should be thinking about contributing to good causes. That's lesson 15. Thanks for being with me. This is Timothy Snyder. Greetings. I'm speaking about my book on tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. This is a book that I wrote in late 2016 to try to prepare Americans and others for what was to come in the late 2010s. It's a book of 20 lessons for individual and civic action. In the last 5 years, this book, I think, has been of use to some people, to my surprise, not just Americans, but people around the world. I've had occasion to revisit this book because I've updated it and am publishing it again in a new and I think in a much better form, illustrated by the fantastic graphic artist Nora Krug. So as I've been working through On Tyranny again with Nora, I've been thinking again about the lessons. I'm making these 20 videos as a way to speak about how these lessons, I think, have been useful in the last few years and how they might remain useful in years to come. Today we're up to lesson number 16 from On Tyranny, which is learn from peers in other countries. I'm going to read the lesson and then make a few remarks. Learn from peers in other countries. Keep up your friendships abroad or make new friends in other countries. The present difficulties in the United States are an element of a larger trend, and no country is going to find a solution by itself. Make sure you and your family have passports. So I'm an American and I'm a historian, but I'm not an American historian. I'm a historian of other parts of the world, and I've spent a good deal of my life in other parts of the world. That was of great help to me in writing the book. A lot of the things that seem commonsensical to me in the book, and which I think might have proved useful to Americans from the book, I learned from former political prisoners, dissidents, oppositionists in other countries. And this, in a way, is where the whole book comes from. I'm an American. I care about my country. I think I do have a sense of what's exceptional about it. But exceptionalism, the idea that your country is always and in everything exceptional, the idea that your country is always and in everything better than other countries, the idea that your country, for example, is automatically a democracy no matter what happens, that idea is doom. And that idea almost doomed us. It was that idea, or my opposition to that idea, that motivated me to write this book in the first place. I felt very powerfully in the year 2016, when I first wrote this book, that what I was seeing in the US was familiar precisely because I'd seen it in other countries. I'd seen similar things in Ukraine. I'd seen similar things in Russia. I'd seen similar things in history. And I was very worried by the American tendency, the American exceptionalist tendency to say, our institutions will protect us. This was a terrible mistake because, of course, institutions, whether they're ours or not, are only as good as we are. They only hold up when we prop them up. They only stand for us when we stand for them. And so the very idea that our institutions will protect us was a way of stepping back and relying upon precisely American exceptionalism. But American exceptionalism isn't something you can rely on. If it exists at all, it exists only in the individual exceptional behavior of individual exceptional Americans. We can see the same thing a bit now, too, with the hopes that people place in our Constitution. I like the Constitution too. I have a romantic attachment to the Constitution as well. But the idea that the Constitution on its own is going to protect us in the 2020s is just not true. The idea that the Constitution alone is going to protect American democracy, is going to create an American right to vote, that's just not true. The ideas in the Constitution, the ways that the Constitution is interpreted, even what the very words in the Constitution mean and which ones we choose to emphasize, that depends upon us. That the Constitution has to do with rights, for example, is an idea that has to come from us. The idea that the Constitution involves a right to vote is not something which is necessarily clear in the minds of a lot of people who are interpreting the Constitution. That has to come from us. And that is, of course, one of the things that we can learn from other countries. Democracy, interestingly, really is popular among people and really is unpopular among oligarchs. And a lot of the things we see around the world are just as simple as that. One of the things we can learn from other countries, from people who have behaved more courageously often than we have in places like Slovakia or Belarus, is that people really do care about voting, that people who have had harsher experiences than Americans have, people whose lives have been further down the line towards authoritarianism, realize just how important a vote is. That's something that we can learn from our own history, of course, but it's also something we can learn from other countries. But there's one more thing I wanted to say about this. Dropping the American exceptionalism is liberating. When you are living in a world of American exceptionalism, you're expecting someone else to take care of things for you. That's not freedom. Expecting that America is going to take care of things for you is un-American. There is no America out there that can take care of things for you. America only exists insofar as Americans take care of things for themselves. There is no beautiful, perfect America that exists beyond the things that we say and we think, and above all, the things that we do. So in this sense, if you really want to be a free person, if you really want to be a free American, you have to drop the American exceptionalism. You have to drop that right away, and you have to realize we are all in this together. Democracy is rising or falling around the world. The lessons that we can learn are common. And the moment that we're capable of learning from other people, we actually become more free ourselves. That's what I meant by lesson 16. Thank you. Greetings, I'm Timothy Snyder. It's the summer of 2021, and I am revisiting my book on tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. I'm doing this in part because it's been almost 5 years since I wrote the book. I wrote it in late 2016, trying to prepare Americans for the Trump administration, trying to prepare Americans for the decline of democracy around the world that we faced in the last 5 years. But I'm also revisiting it because it's coming out again in a new version, a graphic edition with updated text. I think the new edition is much more interesting and much deeper, thanks to the fantastic work of the illustrator Nora Krug than the original book was. But I'm also just happy in general to have a chance to speak about the things things in the book which, alas, are still with us. So I think it's right to say that when On Tyranny appeared, much of the reaction was, this is an exaggeration. Over the course of the 4 or 5 years since, most of the things that I talked about as possibilities in the book became realities. And of course, the larger point of the book is, if you can anticipate these things, if you can recognize them as they're happening, as they're incipient, then sometimes you can put a stop to them. So I think this unfortunately is the case. It's unfortunately the case that our problems were not just Mr. Trump. Our problems have to do with our institutions, with our constitutional system, and fundamentally with ourselves. So if we're going to solve the problems, we have to begin with ourselves, and that's where the book begins, with the things that we can do as individuals. Today I'm on lesson 17, which is listen for dangerous words. I'm going to read the lesson and then say a few words about what I meant by it. So, Number 17, listen for dangerous words. Be alert to the use of the words extremism and terrorism. Be alive to the fatal notions of emergency and exception. be angry about the treacherous use of patriotic vocabulary. So when I'm writing these words in 2016, what I have in mind as a historian are historical examples. I'm thinking of moments where a state of exception or the idea of an exception was used to shift from one kind of political system to another. Perhaps the classical example is the transition from the Weimar Republic in Germany to the Nazi regime in 1933, which Hitler justified by way of an emergency, which generated a state of exception. A more recent example is Russia at the very end of the 20th century, where Mr. Putin was able to manufacture what seemed like an emergency, a war, which justified the transition into a more authoritarian regime. But the truth of the matter is that we don't need those historical examples. If we look hard enough at ourselves, we can recognize something like this can happen to us because something like this did just happen to us. At the end of the year 2020 and the beginning of the year 2021, we as Americans passed through a fake emergency. The fake emergency was the idea that an election was stolen. Nothing of the sort happened, but a fake emergency is the cover under which a real coup d'etat can take place. And of course, a coup d'etat was attempted. Insofar as that coup d'etat was resisted and defeated, it's in part because people were able to listen for and recognize dangerous words. People understood that when the president spoke of enemies, he often meant good citizens. People recognized that when the president spoke of fraud, he meant votes that he didn't want counted. People recognized that when the president spoke of cities, he meant black people and his idea that black people's votes shouldn't count. When we listen for dangerous words, when we learn from history and from our own history what words actually mean, we can get out a little bit ahead and stop the worst things from happening. Another very dangerous idea, which reappeared in late 2020, was the idea of a stab in the back. The stab in the back is the notion that the good guys would have won if not for the traitors at home. The stab in the back idea comes precisely from Germany in the early 20th century. It's the idea that Germany would have won the First World War had not the Jews and the socialists betrayed Germany at home. One of the things that I realized was dangerous, or that I recognized as a dangerous word in late 2020, was this idea that Mr. Trump articulated of being himself stabbed in the back, the idea that he, the most powerful man after all in the world, that he was a victim, that everyone was lined up against him, that he would have won had it not been for those traitors. That's a historical pattern which I noticed, but not only I noticed that. Fortunately, people who are smarter and more important than me also noticed that pattern and recognize that the stab in the back is not just a lie. The stab in the back is also an excuse. The stab in the back is a reason to say, they struck first, therefore all I'm doing is striking back. The stab in the back is a way that the powerful have of making themselves seem like the victims. A stab in the back is a way of saying that anything goes. We resisted that. We overcame it, at least for now. But those dangerous words of 2020, the big lie that Mr. Trump won the election, the big lie that the election was not carried out well, those dangerous words are still with us. We recognize them, many of us did, and that was very important. The next step, of course, is going to be good enough, is to become good enough patriots that we can find truths and that we can find reassuring words and that we can find better electoral institutions so that nothing like this ever happens again.